Good evening. My name is Kai Bird. Well, I want to offer a warm welcome to yet another biography event. I have the honor of serving as the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support for the Biography Center. Specifically, I want to thank her for her recent rather incredible contribution of $10 million to our endowment fund and a pledge of $5 million in matching grants. Please note that our next event will be on February 20th at 6:30 p.m. when former fellow Adam Plunkett will be in conversation with another former Leon Levy fellow, Heather Clark. They will be discussing Adam's new biography of Robert Frost. If you have not already done so, please register your email address on our website so that you can be notified of future events. But tonight I'm delighted to welcome Rachel Kousser to discuss her recent biography of Alexander the Great. She will be in conversation with Michael Seymour. Rachel is professor at Brooklyn College and executive officer of the program in classics at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Kousser is the author of The Afterlives of Greek Sculpture, Interaction, Transformation, Destruction, and another book, Hellenistic and Roman Ideal Sculpture, The Allure of the Classical. She has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Getty Research Institute, and the Center for the Advanced Study of the Visual Arts. Michael Seymour is Associate Curator in the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He is the author of Babylon, Legend, History, and the Ancient City. He was also co-curator of the exhibits Babylon, Myth, and Reality at the British Museum in the year 2008, and The World Between Empires, Art and Identity in the Ancient Middle East. He is currently part of a large team working on the complete renovation and redesign of the Met's galleries for the ancient Near Eastern and Cypriot art. Rachel and Michael will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then they will take questions from our in-person audience. This event is also being live streamed, so hello out there to all our virtual audience. Rachel will also be signing books at the conclusion of this event over there. We will try to end this program after about 1 hour. And again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. Michael, I now turn this conversation over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm very excited to be here and lucky to be able to have the pleasure of asking Rachel some of the questions before we open it up to the floor and hear from you. I hope everyone can hear me okay? Wonderful. So to begin, a natural place to start, this book focuses on the latter part of Alexander's life and picks up really after the sort of great battles and in some ways it begins with an ending. So a natural question is what led you to focus on this part of his life? And to set us off, I'm not going to do this a lot, but I'll start us with just a quote from the book, from your epilogue. You write, neither those celebrating Alexander as a proto-imperialist, nor those condemning him as such do justice to his history. Both tend to understand him by reading history backward, extrapolating from later, better documented empires to that of the Macedonian king. But in fact, Alexander operated very differently from later empire builders, and the key to understanding why he did so, and what made him, quote-unquote, great, lies in his last years. His failures then, and the choices he made in response, were the ones that defined his legacy. So I thought maybe we could start by talking about that.
Absolutely. Can you all hear me well? Okay, wonderful. So yes, my book starts where many are kind of running out of steam or stopping. It begins in Persepolis, when Alexander is staring up at this huge, powerful royal city in 330 BCE. It's cold, it's probably January, February. And he's this young, implausibly successful king who has, over the past 3 years, conquered what is essentially the first European empire in the Middle East. He was 25. Yeah, makes us all feel inadequate by contrast. And everyone is expecting him to kind of cash in and go home. Instead, he burns the palace down and keeps heading east. And it's a wild ride where he meets naked Indian yogis, he fights elephants, he marries 3 times, Macedonian kings are polygamous, and buries his closest friend. And in the process, he creates this amazing empire that stretches from Albania to Pakistan, the largest empire up to that point in the ancient world, the largest lifetime empire, save that of Genghis Khan. And, you know, these later years when he's doing this, from Persepolis onwards, are often considered by scholars as kind of the degenerate aftermath of a once promising reign. But in fact, to me, they are fascinating because this is where he runs into trouble. And it's through the resistance he has to deal with that he's transformed from this kind of effortlessly successful king into a mature, cautious, pragmatic leader, frequently unorthodox and at times unheroic. So to me, this is when Alexander becomes great, after his empire strikes back.
Wonderful. And actually, I think we get a sense from that. It's a wonderful, compelling, really engaging biography that races along and stays very close to Alexander himself all the way through. You know, I think you're always coming back to trying to get at his personal experience, his life. And I think anyone here who works on ancient material will know how incredibly difficult it is to do that, to form a single solid ancient biography in that way. And I know, you know, in doing it, you have to deal with a whole array of sources, and it must sometimes be a challenge to sort of get to that single compelling narrative, especially when maybe you're normally used to writing in another way. Are there times when that sort of was a challenge?
It was very challenging because for those of you who haven't dug deep into the Alexander literature, there are most biographies of Alexander are based on the ancient literary sources, and these sources are late. The earliest is about 300 years after Alexander. So imagine if you were writing a biography of George Washington and you had nothing that was written down until right now. That's how distant they were from him. And they are also biased because they are looking at him always from a Greco-Roman lens, never, for instance, a Persian one. So as, you know, I was writing this biography, I was drawing on these sources. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But as an archaeologist, I was really leaning into my expertise in material culture. So for example, so there's this big discussion among historians, like why is Alexander burning down the palace at Persepolis? Is it intentional, or is this a dinner party that got really out of hand? And the ancient sources, the ancient literary sources, are in conflict. They disagree with one another, so there's not much you can do in mining the texts. But as an archaeologist, I looked to the excavation reports. Persepolis has been well excavated by what was then the University, the Oriental Institute of Chicago in the 1930s. It's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And there are these 3 huge volumes. And I remember sitting in the Columbia University library with these big old volumes from the 50s, going through them and thinking, you know, this is evidence that people have not really known how to use. Because when you look through the sources, you can see how thoroughly Alexander and his men looted the site of anything valuable and portable. You can see where they heaped up things like cloth of gold textiles to make fires. You can even see where they dropped little things, like there's a place where they seem to have dropped a few rosettes, little gold rosettes, on the way up the stairs, kind of the way that you get in a bottleneck on the subway going up the stairs when there's only one subway staircase, that kind of thing. And from this evidence, you can see how this was not just a drunken orgy. This was meticulously planned and carefully executed. And this tells us something about what Alexander was like as a leader. It also tells us from these like concrete, specific objects that were destroyed, just what the conquest was like for the conquered. And that was really important to me as well.
I think one of the joys of the book is the creation from archaeological and textual sources of some very vivid and complete and embodied feeling scenes, and the emptying of the treasury and the destruction of Persepolis are a great case in point of that. We thought we'd show just a few objects that are relevant to the story, and this one, all from the Met, and this one is a stone bowl from the Persepolis treasury. And the reason I think it's particularly relevant, we don't know this for a fact, but as you can imagine, in the archaeology, what you find are that the gold and silver vessels are gone, that the stone vessels, the heavy stone vessels, remain. But interestingly, so many of them, these big, solid, hard stone vessels, were smashed. And one of the theories about this is that they were smashed in the course of stripping them of precious metals that were added to their surfaces. So I think this is a really powerful object because it potentially speaks to that moment.
Absolutely. And, you know, you don't smash things to get a little bit of gold off them in the middle of a fire. So this is, again, one of those moments where you think this is a good evidence of the premeditation and the doing this, not, you know, super slowly, but with some effort. And it also, there's something about, to me, these concrete objects and seeing their destruction that really, you know, I wanted to get across in this very first chapter just how destructive Alexander could be. And so there's something about these objects that really brings it home to me.
And in terms of what they probably were taking from the treasury, we can get some sense from, these are the sort of vessels that unfortunately very rarely come from excavation. I'm going to show two, you know, acquired from the art market in the 20th century. But this one carries a trilingual inscription of Darius. We can't be sure that it's the Darius the Great or Darius II, but the inscription is in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, and you get this immediate sense of these vessels as part of the royal image. There are all sorts of surviving stories about how these vessels were used, how they were gifted. So we're looking at more than just luxury tableware here. We're looking at sort of politics and diplomacy in objects, I think. And maybe I'll show one more. This is a silver fiale with an inscription of Artaxerxes, and it's actually one of 4 that ended up in different museums around the world. And it, again, goes to the expression of the royal image, but also, I think, it gives you a very vivid sense of this is the kind of vessel that you see depicted on the reliefs at Persepolis. It's really, even in style, the Achaemenid kings developed a composite style that incorporated aspects of Babylonian, Assyrian, and Egyptian art to make something new that was really closely tied to the royal image, to the image of the great king. These sort of great undecorated flat surfaces that you see on these bowls, it's very much a product of its time, and perhaps in our age of machine-made objects, it's not the first thing you'd look at, but of course this is a very difficult thing to do to this to this standard, and that's part of what's going on with these vessels. So all to say that Alexander is coming into a world with an extremely vivid, well-formed, centuries-old image of what the great king is, and I think that's a theme that you pick up in the book.
Absolutely, and this reminds me particularly of this moment, the story of Alexander, right after the Battle of Issus, one of his first great battles. He's captured the royal tent of Darius, and the Persian king did not travel light. And so he has his officers prepare a dinner in Persian fashion for him, and a bath and all the rest of it. He goes in and he looks at probably some really nice vessels like this, and you have to imagine that Persian food is like, you know, French haute cuisine. Macedonian is more like fast casual. And he looks around at all this and he goes, so this is what it's like to live like a king. I think he had a tremendous appreciation for what the Persian king was like, and a tremendous excitement about sort of being able to inhabit that role.
Well, that leads us on nicely to one of the themes that keeps recurring in the book, and I think highlights the problem you noted about textual sources from hundreds of years later. Certainly, based on those sources, we get this strong image of Alexander as being actually rather out of step with most of his Macedonian companions in his willingness and readiness to adopt aspects of Persian royal clothing, court behavior, who's close to him, how he structures the government, how he structures the army even, which you stress. I mean, it'd be great to hear a little of your sense of that, and how much are we seeing the individual there? How much are we seeing the historiographic tradition? 'Cause it's a fascinating aspect of him.
Yeah, I mean, to me, one of the things that's most intriguing about Alexander, and also makes him most relevant for today, is that what he's trying to do is to forge a multicultural state from people of very diverse religions, languages, cultural practices. And he's struggling with issues that we see in the US today, but really all over. Is one group on top? How do minority groups have a share in the government? How do you mitigate the sort of difficulties of rule for those under it? And with Alexander, we see him kind of trying and failing and trying again to figure this out in a way that is totally pragmatic. Like, he is not doing this because he has this value for multiculturalism in his own state. He is doing this because, okay, the Macedonian state in the time of Alexander's father, his whole territory is about 17,000 miles. The Persian Empire is about 2 million. Macedonia is a rounding error in the Persian Empire. And he is trying to control that empire with this tiny, tiny army from this tiny place. And so he is doing this pragmatically. But I will say, and this is where he gets into friction with his men, he is operating pragmatically to power share and integrate in a way that most Greeks and Macedonians of his time would not have done, even if it would have better served their interests. They still wouldn't have done it. So for example, one thing he does is to integrate his army. He takes people from everywhere he conquers. So by the end, by his last battle in what is present-day Pakistan, he has cavalrymen from Afghanistan because they've got the best horses. He's got sailors from Egypt and Phoenicia because they have the best navies. He's got archers from India, they're really great archers. And so when he's doing his final battle, he is like the conductor of an amazing orchestra. He's figured out how to use all of these different people, the best that they can do to make his army as a whole more effective. And then later, when his Macedonian soldiers are on the brink of mutiny, it's these people from his empire, it's those soldiers that he goes to, and they're the ones that save him. So I think that his story is one about why it's so difficult to forge a multicultural state, but also what some of the payoffs might be.
And all the while, as they're moving through this world, or at least almost all the while, they're moving through Achaemenid lands, meeting Achaemenid monuments and power structures. You know, Alexander is encountering governments that are used to the Achaemenid great king, adapting to that. There's one really striking episode I noted when they come to an old Persian royal hunting ground near Marakanda, so Samarkand, and it's a reminder that they're encountering these physical symbols and structures of the Achaemenid Empire. And they go hunting in this Achaemenid royal hunting ground. And of course, you can talk about his Macedonian hunting connections, but he's performing a role of the great king. And, you know, do you see him sort of increasingly embodying that Iranian recognizably Persian role?
I think he was trying to be the king and fulfill some of the roles of all the places, whether it's the Egyptian pharaoh, whether it's a Mesopotamian king when he's in Babylon, or whether it's a Persian king. And the thing that's amazing to me about Alexander is the way that he figures out how not just to sort of do this in a window dressing way, but to really use the structures, the deep administrative structures of the Persian Empire to make his conquests more effective. And I think that one of the sort of realizations I came to while I was writing this book is that, you know, many people, many historians have said, well, Alexander conquers the Persian Empire because the Persian Empire was weak. And what I think he did instead was he was able to use the Persian Empire's strengths against itself, like a sort of jiu-jitsu master, by co-opting the Persian king's best subordinates, adding men to his army, and making use of the Persian administrative system, which is so brilliant and effective and had been ruling this empire for 200 years. So for example, one of my favorite things is the way he uses the Persian messenger system. The messenger system that was able to get a message from, according to the historian Herodotus, from Sardis in present-day Turkey to Susa in present-day Iran, which is about 1,500 miles. The estimates are in about 12 days. And there's, for all of you who walked by the big post office on 8th Avenue and 32nd, 33rd, there's this quote on it from Herodotus where it says, you know, neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. That's the Persian messenger system Herodotus is talking about because he thought it was so impressive. And so that's the kind of thing Alexander was able to access that helped him conquer. And I think, again, this tells us something about him as a leader in the way he's able to function not so much through overwhelming force, but rather through negotiating and co-opting and figuring out how to work within a system that was already working well.
And perhaps you also get a sense of him thinking of his own legacy, his own political image, and trying to make himself part of that tradition. You stopped to discuss him going to Pasargadae and working on the tomb of Cyrus, really connecting with that Achaemenid legacy. And it does make you wonder about those long-term legacies. In Persian tradition, there are a couple of different strands of Alexander tradition, but one that you find in the Shahnameh is of a situation where Darius, Dara, and Alexander, Sikander, have a conversation essentially at Darius's deathbed, where Darius hands on the kingship to Alexander. So you wonder if, in some ways, he was an enormous success in that sense. And I know Pierre Briand has sort of framed the idea that you might see Alexander as the last Achaemenid. So I don't know if you think that's maybe going too far, but it's certainly a really interesting connection.
Yeah, I think he's certainly trying to, in many ways, become a Persian great king, but I don't want to downplay the challenges. So, for example, there's this one story where he's trying to deal with the Persian queen mother, a woman named Sisygambis. And he's captured the royal family at this point, but not the king himself. And he's trying to figure out how to deal with them. And so one day he gets a shipment of wool and weavers from Macedonia. And he's very excited. And he sends them off to Sisygambis with this message that if she and her granddaughters like the wool cloth, the weavers can teach them how to make more. Now, from a Greek or Macedonian perspective, this is a great gift, because every woman, from the lowest servant to the highest queen, is supposed to be a weaver. Think of Penelope in the Odyssey, weaving and unweaving the shroud of Laertes. But from Persian perspective, it looks a little different. In their perspective, it's the work of servants. So imagine if you had been queen of this amazing empire and somebody sent you a mop. The messenger comes back to Alexander and says, Persian queen has tears in her eyes. And to his credit, Alexander goes to her and apologizes. He says, my mother and my sisters made the clothes I'm wearing, and I was misled by my own customs. So what you're seeing here is him recognizing that what he thinks is normal, what natural, is in fact just customary. He's beginning to adjust his cultural viewpoint, which is pretty amazing for somebody who had almost untrammeled political power. So I think it's that ability to kind of change course and see things from other perspectives that made Alexander such an effective political negotiator. But I think the story is also a reminder that last of the Achaemenids or not, he had to sometimes change course and admit that he was wrong. And he did.
Yeah, it's a really powerful aspect of the book. There are many occasions in this part of his life of frustration, of setbacks and recalibrating, even of real, regret and grief. After the killing of Clytus, and I wonder, in these moments, again, the difficulty of ancient biography. Do you in those moments sometimes feel that you're getting at an individual in those experiences?
So trying to separate the individual from, like the fish from the ocean he swims in is really hard in the ancient world. particularly for someone like Alexander, who was so formed, for example, by Homer's epic, the Iliad, his favorite book that supposedly he brought with him everywhere he went. And he tremendously admired Achilles, who he was convinced was, in fact, his ancestor on his mother's side. Not making this up. And there are these moments like the death of Clytus. So Clytus is this older man of Alexander's father's generation. And at one point, they're at this banquet in Samarkand. And it's a really difficult time. Alexander's about 2 years into a really awful guerrilla war in Afghanistan that he's managed to trigger. And Macedonian banquets have two things. One of them is a lot of wine. The other is weapons. As my students said when I was telling them this story, what could go wrong? So both Clytus and Alexander get very drunk. Clytus says a lot of angry things to him particularly about his sort of Persianizing, acting in Persian ways. And Alexander finally completely loses his temper, grabs a spear, and runs him through. Then he tries to kill himself. And they carry him off to his bed. He weeps and refuses food for 3 days. He does all these things that are very Achilles-like. And trying to decide, is this Achilles or is this Alexander? It may not even be the right question. Because what it strikes me as is, through Achilles, he's able to access this kind of full range of human emotions and to express things like regret and responsibility for doing things that he sees as unforgivable. Killing Clytus was somebody who had earlier saved his life in battle. So it was really horrible. So I feel that through this kind of culture, he's able to access his full humanity and his full range of emotions. And that is, I think it's very admirable, and is probably maybe a more healthy way of dealing with them than perhaps certain contemporary models of masculinity and heroism. So.
Well, actually, I mean, that entanglement or that inseparability, that's a great cue for, I'll go to our next image, or images. Coins, a couple of instances of the royal image, both of the Persian great king and of Alexander, or is it? And both are ambiguous. On the left, you see what's called a daric. Now, I believe, you'll correct me, but one of these was a sort of mercenary soldier's month's salary in Xenophon. That's our sort of reference point for them. And their iconography changes a little, but they're usually this figure who seems like a king. He's wearing an Achaemenid crown, and he's often holding a bow and arrow and or a spear. And we don't really know if we should read this figure as the king of the moment, the king in general, the heroic king as an idea, or as a divinity. All of those are really possible in this image, and it may be that even some of that ambiguity was intended. On the right, you have a tetradrachm of Alexander, actually from Pasargadae, from the site of from the city where the tomb of Cyrus is. And what you see is an image that we call the young Heracles. You see him with his lion's head. The question is it also an image of Alexander? How much is it an image of Alexander? This equation of Alexander with Achilles, with Dionysus, with the young Heracles, is this thoroughgoing sort of mythological paradigm. And so, to what you say, it's interesting that even in the royal image, we're facing such a similar problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, in both cases, I think there's both a role and there's an individual. And Alexander is fascinating because of his ability to look to these different people, from Achilles, to Heracles to Dionysus. I think he had aspects of all of them, and they all allowed him to express certain parts of his personality.
And then, so far we've been talking all about adopting aspects of the Achaemenid Empire, working through the Achaemenid Empire. And perhaps toward the later part of the book and in India, perhaps you see him start to run out of that imperial infrastructure a little bit. Would that be your reading?
Yeah, so he gets to a particular site east of the Indus River in what is probably present-day Pakistan. And finally, he gets to the point where his soldiers say, enough. And there's a big argument, big question among scholars, like, why? Why did they finally get to that point? I wonder if it's less that they finally got to the point of saying enough, and it's more that he got to the point where he was able to hear them. Because they had been, they expected by the time they conquered Persepolis, they were ready to go. And I think they were hoping for their demobilization then, and he's been going on for another, what is that now at that point, 6 or 8 years. So I think what happens in what the Greeks called India, although most of it, as far as we can tell, he never gets past present-day Pakistan, is that he is finally able to listen. He gives this big spiel about how we're going to go, and we're going to go keep going, and this is what's going to happen. And they finally say, like, we are done. And this is a moment that most historians would see as one of his greatest failures, his greatest defeats, when he is forced to turn back and go home. I'm not sure I see it that way. And that may have something to do with my historical experience writing the book. So I was working on this chapter in the summer of 2020, during the middle of the George Floyd protests. And I remember thinking to myself, people call this a mutiny, but there is no violence on the soldiers' part. This has, to me, much more in common with a kind of peaceful political protest. And what is striking to me about Alexander is that he's mad. He clearly recognizes that he has miscalculated. But he backs down and he never seeks to quell the protest with violence. And that ability to recognize the limits of his power and to listen to the people and recognize that he rules, in essence, only with the, to some extent, with the collaboration of those he governs, to me was a moment of a kind of unheralded greatness.
No, that's fantastic. And it's, again, so hard to reach the ancient perspective on it. And in this case, as you say, multiple, somewhat conflicting perspectives of what that greatness would be, what the bigger move was. But having made it, we move into, and we'll make this the last couple of questions before we open up to the floor, the return to the western part of the empire, and specifically to Babylon in Iraq. And I'll, for theme, flick forward to, we were talking about this a little bit. So these lions are not even Achaemenid, they're Neo-Babylonian, they're from the empire before Alexander. But they're absolutely relevant here because he's walking into this ancient city whose structures have been built up in layers, and he intends to make a capital there.
Yeah, absolutely. This is what ends up being the last year of his life. He decides to anchor himself in Babylon at a very difficult moment in his life. He's just lost Hephaestion, his closest friend and likely lover, something I go into more in the book. And he decides to make Babylon his capital and also the burial place for Hephaestion. And although some historians sort of see him as kind of running out of steam at this point, I would say that this is a kind of moment of resilience where he is creating something new in this very old place, this place that by Alexander's time had been a capital for what, like 2,000 years? So that's like us making a capital in Rome. You know, it had this amazing long history before he gets there, and he decides, this is the center of my empire. I am not going back to Macedonia, thank you very much. I am staying right here in the middle to rule from there, and this is where he builds this huge, elaborate, fascinating funerary pyre, one of the great ephemeral works of art of the Hellenistic period for Hephaestion. And it's a kind of a moment where he is not just sort of running out, I think, of ideas or energy, but showing a kind of resilience and a willingness for new beginnings. I would also say that he knew by this point that his wife, Roxanne, was pregnant with the son that was born in the event after his death. So I think he is in this moment showing a kind of resilience that is one of the qualities I really admire. There's a lot I don't love about Alexander, and I don't want to whitewash him. He had tremendous power, and he used it to do some terrible things. But his resilience is something I have come to admire, and I feel like something we could all use a little more of right now, right?
And then to get to the very end of his life, he's doing so many things, as you say, to consciously integrate the different parts of his empire and his world in his royal image, in the way he governs. But he's still in Babylon too, in a world that in some ways is largely unfamiliar to him. And there are these incredible, eerie episodes, I would say, toward the end that certainly to me seem to have echoes of something very ancient in Babylon, the substitute king ritual. And maybe before we open it up to the audience, I'll just ask you to say just a word about that, those last days.
Yeah, so in Babylon, there are these very powerful astronomer priests who, figured out amazing things about, say, lunar eclipses, and they were very worried about Alexander. And so it is likely on their advice that he leaves his throne and his royal robes in what must have been like May, June, so pretty warm, and goes off, and a man comes in, and from the Greco-Roman sources, it seems very mysterious. This guy comes in and puts on the robes and sits on the throne. And the Greeks and the Greeks and Macedonians are just freaked out. And the priests are consulted, and they say, the right thing to do, execute him. And it just seems from the Greco-Roman perspective like an eerie portent, but this is a